So my name is Tim Stallman. I'm a freelance cartographer based in Durham, North Carolina, and this talk is about a project that I started in 2016. It's a public history exhibit project called Bull City 150. And what we're doing is looking really deeply at the history of Durham, North Carolina, through particularly a lens of racial equity as a way to try to have policy conversations around issues of affordable housing right now, and then issues of jobs and healthcare and education and political representation in the city moving forward. So this talk is kind of a little bit more of a behind-the-scenes talk about the project. So I'm going to walk through some of the different maps that we designed, some of the techniques we developed to work with historical data, and then at the end get to some of the things we didn't do that I really wish we had time for and hopefully will have time for in the coming years, contingent on funding. This was happening to one of the presenters last session, so hopefully it doesn't happen too much. This cable is really a mess. So I also wanted to give some thanks to so many folks collaborated on this project, but particularly the other team members. Mel Norton was the project director. Tia Hall was our community research director. Kimber Heinz was the exhibit product manager. She's a public historian and really taught me a lot about what exhibit design is different from cartographic design. Bob Korstad is the faculty director. Rebecca Miel came on the last minute as a designer. Karan Kareem also was our web designer. And then a bunch of other folks that helped out in different ways. This photo is kind of what the exhibit looks like in process. So as I mentioned, we started research early 2016. The project is based out of the Cook Center for Social Equity at Duke University. It's really just the cable, unfortunately. Yeah. I'm gonna have to. Yeah, if you want to, you can hold that. Yeah, that'd be great. And why Bull City 150? Because Durham is coming up on its 150th anniversary, its sesquicentennial in 2019. And the idea is to start a citywide conversation about what our 150-year history as a city means for the future of the city. And what the goal here also was to do a traveling exhibit, and you'll see this throughout the design, so it's actually like on a series of pop-ups that can move around, because we wanted, really the ultimate goal of the exhibit is to foster conversation about a series of issues, so we want to be able to take it anywhere in the city. So for those of y'all who don't know, so Durham, North Carolina is on the eastern coast of the United States. We're about 3 hours from the beach. We're about 3 hours from the mountains. It's in the Research Triangle region of North Carolina, a region which has seen a lot of new tech jobs and biotech jobs recently. And Durham has been, for the past sort of 30 years, undergoing a transition from a tobacco and textile economy. The last tobacco plants shut down in 1990, the last cigarette manufacturers, to more of a high-tech startup economy. So right now a lot of the new jobs are in biotech and technology startups. But that has brought a lot of issues of affordable housing, particularly to the city. And so one of the things that the city is really grappling with, particularly in the past year, it's become nearly impossible to get like an affordable apartment as new folks are moving in. And there's not a lot of land left to build new housing in the city as well. So we're, interestingly, Durham is a really politically engaged city, and it's a city of about 200,000, so it's the kind of place where you can still sort of have a citywide conversation about an issue like this. And so the role that we came in was trying to bring a historical perspective to a lot of the things that were on people's minds. And I think it's also really funny, Durham is sort of this boom town right now that's advertised as like one of the best places to live, et cetera. When we were doing the archival research, we came up with a lot of these real estate brochures from like the 1920s that are, pretty similar. Durham is one of the best advertised towns in the world, which I'm not sure that was actually true at all. So the exhibit was 27 pop-up panels, kind of trade show style, so you can fold them down into a carrying case, which makes it really nice to travel with. 2 interactives, one of which is still in the works. We really were on a tight production schedule, unfortunately. It was the first time this team had really done a production process, and so as I'll get to later on, we had a lot to learn together, and so we kind of ran out of time at the end. There's some artwork by Mariah Lefebvre, who's a collage photo artist, so this is an original piece she did. for the exhibit, and then we also have 4 more of her pieces, and those pieces kind of bring the history of the project into the present. So she does these collages with photographs of current construction sites across the city, and then kind of collaging them with archival historical photos. So this piece was actually done in conjunction with an interview with a resident of the neighborhood that's a demolished public housing complex that's still vacant. That's 27 acres. That's probably the last big site to build in the city. And we had 2 full-time staff. I was a part-time research cartographer, and Tia was a part-time community research director. And it was about, on my part, probably about like 400 hours of research and mapping to put this project together. If folks are interested in kind of the scale, and I would have really liked to have about twice as much time. But like I said, we ran into a deadline. So what I'm going to do is walk through a few of the panels and sections in detail first, and then kind of get to some lessons learned and new directions. So the exhibit is kind of starts at before Durham was founded as a city and covers through the 1960s. So it's really a lot of ground. And one of the big challenges was organizing the material thematically, and really also digging into the history in a way that would be interpretable. So the first section I'm going to talk about is this Landless People Coming to Durham section. So this is actually sort of the second major chunk of the exhibit, and what it does is look at the first boom. So Durham had its first boom between 1900 and 1920. The city's population really skyrocketed, and there were 2 factors that were pushing people into the city. So one was sharecropping. A lot of folks in North Carolina at that time were tenant farmers, and we don't get into this in the exhibit, but the legal structure had actually changed a lot to make farming very difficult for folks that didn't own a lot of land. So folks have kind of heard about the privatization of the commons in England in like the 1600s and 1700s. In North Carolina, that happened in the 1870s through a series of laws about fencing in where your cattle could, your livestock could graze and things like that. So that, combined with railroads, combined with other economic changes, made it increasingly difficult for folks to make a living tenant farming. And so in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of farm families were bouncing from farm to farm to farm to farm. And then when the textile mills opened up, they saw an opportunity for steady income in the city and moved in. So we're kind of talking about that in the first panel there, which you can see on the left-hand side of this photo. But then the other really crucial factor was that Durham had a really strong black population and 2 pretty thriving black neighborhoods, one of which, Hayti, was sort of known the world around. So W.E. Du Bois actually almost came to teach in Durham at Hayti at NC Central. In the 1920s, it was such a center for black culture. And so at the same time that Durham was becoming known as this kind of beacon for black culture and black people in the South, white supremacist violence was increasing in the countryside in North Carolina all around. And so folks were pushed out of the countryside into the city, both by an economic system, but also by racist violence and white supremacist violence. And these are sort of 2 things that we see a lot of resonances with what's happening today. So we wanted to present those. So the panel kind of walks through these 2 structural economic factors, but then at the end of it, we dig into some really specific stories of how people actually came to Durham. So these got out of order. This is the Landless People panel that talks about tenant farming. And you'll see some things that here with the exhibit design, we were continually cutting down text out of the script over the course of the project. And I learned a lot about just how much text you can fit on a panel. So this is sort of like, I think our smallest type is maybe 60 point on this. This is a 6 or 7 foot tall by 3 foot panel. And the largest type is 200 point. And so we really, I kept on going back and forth. We had basically a researcher who was doing the bulk of the script writing. So for this, you have a script that kind of goes panel by panel by panel and includes, we want this image, we want this theme. And then we had an exhibit designer who was working on the script, and then it would come to me to lay out. And I was continually going back and saying, no, this is too much text. We can't fit this much text. We have to cut text. And then in the final phase of the project, and we iterated a lot, which I'll talk about, we partnered with a graphic designer who had more experience in exhibit design. And so then she was the one telling me that I had too much text on my panels, and we had to cut them down. So we're integrating, some statistical elements, some historical photographs, and a lot of prompts to the viewers to kind of like dig in to the maps and do some research on their own. So this is a map of tenant farms in Durham, and it's just a really beautiful map in its own right. The lettering on the county names is really cool, I think. And one of the neat things about doing this work was that, I don't know if y'all can see this from the back of the room, but we had to go back to the library and get a high resolution scan of this map, and it's done on canvas originally, and you can actually see the texture and the wrinkles of the canvas in the print that's on the panel. So one of the downsides of working at this scale was, we couldn't fit a lot of text, but one of the really cool advantages was being able to show such gorgeous detail in the images in the final printed panels. So a big part of the exhibit draws on oral history, and a big part of my work was figuring out how to present this oral history in a spatial way. So I want to talk about this first map that we did called Coming to Durham. So we were trying for a long time to figure out how to tell the story of different people coming to Durham and where they came from. And at first we thought we would do like a sort of choropleth map of where folks came from to get to Durham, maybe like a flow map with big arrows. It turned out we couldn't get the data for that. We tried doing some census matching with genealogical records. There was actually a master's thesis from the middle part of the 20th century that had a choropleth map, and then it turned out it was based on a data set of like 10 families. So we couldn't work with that either. So what we ended up doing was, instead of trying to tell the story writ large, digging into some specific family stories of how they came to Durham. And we're really lucky in North Carolina to have the Southern Oral History Program located right next door in Chapel Hill. And they have a really rich archive of interviews that were done in the 1970s and 1980s with folks that were actually part of this migration. So we went back to those interviews and started to identify specific migration stories that would kind of capture these patterns. So these folks are Chester and Roxana Clark. They were interviewed in 1977 when they were living on Canal Street in Durham, and we ended up choosing to highlight their story along with a man named John Patterson's story because it turned out that that Chester Clark and John Patterson formed a gospel quartet when they moved to Durham. So there was this cool multimedia aspect, and we ended up tying it together with a listening station where you could listen to one of their songs. But first we had to explain how these folks got to Durham. So this is what the transcript of the oral history, for folks who haven't worked with oral histories before, the transcripts will look like this a lot. There's time codes. These transcripts don't actually cover a lot of the detail that's in the recording, which is something I was surprised to learn as I was doing the research and went back through the recordings and listened. And what I was trying to do as a cartographer was map these oral history accounts with where we could verify that people actually were, or where the places were that were mentioned in the accounts, which is not as easy as it sounds, for one thing, because at least in the 70s and 80s, oral historians weren't really geographers. They weren't thinking spatially. So they're not asking folks like, okay, well, when you're talking about that place, what's the actual address? Or what was the name of that town again? Or asking them to mark places on a map. We don't have that. And they're also not asking questions like, for women, what was your mother's maiden name? So that's key data that you need to actually locate someone in a census record or in a city directory and kind of see where they are. And the gendered aspect, I'm not really going into the talk, but it was actually a huge challenge. We're trying throughout the exhibit not just to tell the stories of rich white men and not just to tell the stories of men, but over and over again in these interviews. This is an interview with Chester and Roxana Clark, but Roxana hardly speaks and you don't really get her story. And in some other oral histories you get, for example, we relied pretty heavily on a white woman mill worker who was only listed by her husband's name. So her history was done under Mrs. Theodis Williamson. And we were never able to figure out what her first name was at all. And as an exhibit team, we had a lot of back and forth about both like wanting to highlight women's voices more, but also not wanting to be historically inaccurate when they weren't actually in the record. And so one thing we did with Chester's story was actually, he would just say like my wife throughout the story, and we just decided to replace that with Roxana's name as a little move towards that, but it wasn't a lot. So like I was saying, I'm trying to locate these places, and on the right you can see this is the 1937 city directory for Durham. And these city directories are kind of like a phone book, and they have the names of everybody living in the city. And so we actually for a lot of these oral histories, I was actually able to look up and find, okay, we can verify they were at 326 Gray Street in 1937, and then actually locate that point. And it's pretty interesting because you can see the folks listed in this directory are not just sort of property owners or folks that have managerial or middle and upper class jobs, but really everyone living in the city and their occupation. So this is actually, which I'll talk at the end of the talk, a rich data store for not just narrative mapping, but quantitative mapping, if it were digitized properly, because you can really see sort of the class distribution of where folks are living and also the racial distribution. So you can see this directory indicates folks' race by putting a C next to black folk. So this is the map that I came up with. After a few iterations, this is the final exhibit design. And basically, it traces these two sort of color-coded stories. So John Patterson is in blue, and Chester Clark's story is in brown. And I kind of wanted to walk through Chester's story because it's actually really interesting, and some things didn't show up until we put it on a map. So Chester's father was born in Bluefield, West Virginia, up here. And then his family moved to Granville County, so that's the next star. So they're tenant farming there for a while, and then they move again further west to another tenant farm, and that's where he marries Roxana, and he has a great story about asking the guy who owned the farm to drive him over to her place in his Studebaker car so he could propose. And then they move back to Granville County to another farm. But then at that point, tenant farming stops working, and he's trying to find a way of life for himself. So Roxana stays behind at the farm, and Chester moves first back up to a place called Hurricane, which it took me forever to figure out where that was. It doesn't exist anymore, but it turns out it was in northeastern North Carolina. He's doing logging, and it's really interesting because that's right by where his father was born. So how is he familiar with this place that's so far away? Well, one reason might be that actually his family is from there originally, and you wouldn't have seen that unless you put that up on a map. It's not clear in the narrative that Hurricane is anywhere near Bluefield. And then what's really interesting, this being the 1920s, is how mobile he is. He's actually, so after that, he moves up to Pennsylvania and is doing work for a while and sending money back home to try to support his family. And after all that, they finally come to Durham. And another thing that's really interesting about these narratives, and it comes up again and again, so Chester says, I went to the American Tobacco Company and stayed there until I retired in 1963. So he's going all over the country, basically, and then ends up in Durham and stays there. So that says something about what was going on in Durham and what was possible in Durham for folks who were working in industrial jobs at that time. So it was possible to actually make a life and stay. Similarly, John Patterson, whose story is a little bit more local, and again, we had some trouble locating some of these specific places, but he's tenant farming all throughout Wake County. And then he ends up in Cornell Street in Durham, and basically a similar story. He stays in Durham, although he's actually working a lot of different jobs. So we found that viewers really responded pretty positively to this map. It went through some iterations to try to pull out the inset a little bit more and make the flow a little bit clearer. But I think it was a pretty cool technique to try to tell this story with the quotes and really draw people in to that history. And that's something I'm going to keep talking about a little bit later on. We also got into one of the neat things about working on this project was getting to work with the archive of historical maps that exist for Durham. And anyone who's looked at historical maps, there's some obviously really cool hand-drawn maps as well in the past. But we wanted to not just show these, but actually use them as base maps for qualitative mapping. So this is a property ownership map of Durham that I did based on an 1881 hand-drawn map of the city from a bird's eye perspective, but then color shading basically the different parcel boundaries based on the owner. So each of these colors represents sort of one of the large industrial families that bought land in Durham and established, so like the Dukes, the Carrs, the Irwins. And on the finished panel, which you can't see here, but below here we kind of walk through, we have these cards that are tagged with the same color, and they explain the family history. And then they're color-coded to the location on this map. And so for me, it was a cool way to be able to show this really gorgeous base map, but also actually use it to tell a story and not just sort of present it as an artifact. And I think one of the things that we were continually trying to do in this exhibit is not just present like maps and historical images as sort of like standalone artifacts, but use them to tell a story and use them in creative ways. So this section is still about property ownership and real estate, and there's some really cool parallels between real estate development in the city in the 1920s, where speculative real estate development was happening all the time, and real estate development today, where Durham is again booming, and again speculative real estate development is playing a similar role. So one of the pieces we did was this tie into the present, looking at the history of a particular subdivision that was built over the past 20 years. In sort of the northeastern part of the city. And one of the interesting takeaways here is the way, if you follow along on the bottom, we've got the total appraised value. So the value of this area of land goes from $2 million to $64 million in the span of 15 years based on real estate development alone, right? So first it starts out these empty parcels. And what's interesting too is you can see how this land is held by a holding company at the beginning, and then it gets parceled out successively. So the colored parcels are owned by development companies or holding companies. Some of those are national and some of them are local. And then the gray parcels are owned by individual homeowners or individual landowners who don't own other land. So it's kind of an interesting way to see how land changes hands and how it gets parceled out. But even in 2017, one of the kind of things about speculative subdivision development that I find really curious is the way that the holding company still holds on to all these little bits of land in the interstices around the homes. So, what does it mean to own your own home when somebody else owns all the land around it? Is an interesting question. And we had originally actually paired this with a map of also who was building homes in Durham, but we took that off for space reasons. But a lot of these are national, our names are not really well known to Durham residents. So going back, I wanted to dig a little bit more into kind of this idea of place-based narrative, and this next section of the exhibit is called Workers and Renters, and it looks at what life was like in Durham's working-class neighborhoods in the 1920s. And one of the really interesting things about that time is that the neighborhoods were really distinct and also self-contained. So particularly for white mill workers, because the mills built housing for white workers. They didn't build housing for black workers. So particularly for white workers, you were living right across the street from where you worked. The grocery store was down the street. You often wouldn't leave your neighborhood, and there were actually gangs on the street that would like beat people up who were in the wrong neighborhood at night, which we don't think about when we think about the 20s, right? But if you were from East Durham and you were in West Durham at night, you would get sent out, even if you were white. So again, going back to the oral history record, Kimber Heinz, who is one of the researchers, identified a set of narratives, and we kind of boiled them down to these key quotes. So on the left, we've got Mrs. Theodis Williamson, who's a white mill worker at Irwin Mills, and she says, "We worked 10 hours and 15 minutes a day. We get home sometimes after dark. If we wanted to go home and get a biscuit or anything, we'd go home. Then they finally put a fence around that mill, and my mother would come and give it to us through the fence." So this is this narrative of being really close to work. Her mom is like literally bringing her lunch through the fence. And then on the other side, you've got Blanche Scott, who's a black tobacco worker at Liggett & Myers, and she talks about when you got old enough you could work all day, they would let you go to school. The elementary classes would get out at 1 o'clock. That would give me a chance to walk from school to Liggett & Myers, and I'd get down there at about 2 o'clock. And she talks about her grandmother running to work, bringing lunch with her. So for one, there's this difference between having to bring lunch with you every day, but also when you actually start to map out, and I'll show this in a sec, Blanche Scott's journey, she's really going all over the city just to get from her home to school to work and back home in the course of a day, whereas Mrs. Theodis Williamson's house is almost literally across the street from work. So it's a very different experience of place, and we wanted to kind of dig into that a little bit more. So I started experimenting with ways to draw visitors into this history, and this is what we came up with for the first iteration of the exhibit. And it's a tabletop map display. The base map is a 1920s historical base map. And then basically what I did was I mapped all of these people's homes and workplaces and their sort of daily journeys, or what their daily journeys could have been on that base map. And the idea was it's sitting on a tabletop, and there's these 4 what are called rails, and as you're standing, you're facing one of the rails. It's color-coded to a story. You have the quotes and pictures, and then on the map you can kind of trace out, and you can't really see it in the inset, but the labels are also oriented so they face you when you're facing that person's story. And you can kind of trace out their individual journey. So this is a detail on Blanche Scott's journey, and you can kind of see on the map, the blue one here, that's the Mrs. Theodis Williamson's journey, and so you can see just how much shorter that is spatially than Blanche Scott's journey. Again, a limitation because the oral historians weren't doing a geographical oral history is that we had to make up like what these paths might have been based on what the neighborhoods were. And then what I wanted to do was kind of capture like, well, what was happening on this walk to and from work and school. And so I went into the city directories, which I'll get into in detail in a sec, and mapped out what different businesses and churches were actually along those routes. So what would these people have seen in their day-to-day? And then we paired that with this map of the city as a whole that dug into detail a little bit more to the different neighborhoods with photos and stuff using callouts and leader lines. And this is a really early iteration of the design, and so you'll see just like how much the design improved, and notice also how much more text there is on this panel, which people complained about a lot, and so we took it out. But this is the tabletop map in a preview session that we used it, and it was really interesting because the fact that people were facing each other meant that it fostered conversation. So folks were actually talking about like, well, where is this in Durham today? What's going on in Durham today? And folks really connected with, visitors really connected with the stories, with following the stories. So a lot of people said it's like a game. I wish there were game pieces I could move around like for the individual characters. So they really got that narrative aspect. The problem was there wasn't a lot of detail, and people struggled with connecting it with present day geography. We also actually decided as well in the script that we wanted to move away from this narrative of like work and home being interrelated and journeys to work. So in order to do that, we wanted to do a more detailed version of the map. So I went back to the city directories. This is what the city directories look like. A lot of cities have them. Durham's are digitized and on archive.org, which is really great. So you can download the PDFs. And they actually go street by street and tell you what was on each street, and then they tell you the cross streets. So they can be really easily recreated manually into a map if you can figure out which side of the street the odd and even numbers are on, which I drove myself crazy trying to do at first. Or a better approach, which I realized midway through, was that like a lot of these addresses haven't changed. And so starting by typing in the whole business directory into a spreadsheet, which actually didn't take as long as I thought it would, and then just using a present day georeferencing tool, or geocoding tool rather, to geocode those locations, and then going through and manually correcting the ones that didn't make sense. So that's kind of a theme that I learned a lot in this project, was rather than trying to do stuff from scratch, start with present day sources and then change them when they don't match the past, rather than the other way around. This is the full data set, and the black-owned businesses and factories and churches are outlined in blue, and then the white-owned ones are outlined in white, and brown dots are just sort of businesses that are unclassified, like offices or professional offices, and not factories or stores. And you can already actually see quite a lot about the distribution of businesses in the city. And New York City has a really cool space-time directory project, which is crowdsourcing a lot of this work. So I wish that I were there because I wouldn't have had to do this by hand. This is a shot of digitizing the city street grid. And again, I started out tracing stuff by hand off this base map and then realized it would be a lot more useful and was a lot easier to start with the present-day streets and then just copy over the ones that were still in existence and then digitize historical streets so that they actually matched up with the present-day street grid. So that way there weren't as many alignment issues with historical data. So this is the final display. I ended up doing 4 inset maps for each neighborhood that you could actually pick up and look at. And I'll walk through them right quick. This is the West End. This is Blanche Scott's neighborhood. You'll notice that the path lines are missing now because we wanted to talk more about what were the neighborhoods like in whole and less about the individual narratives. This is West Durham, so this is Theodis Williamson's home, and you can see her home is right there, and there's the factory where she works, like right across the street. Versus for Blanche Scott, her workplace is not even on the map. It's kind of up to the northeast of the map. And And these incorporate the business directory locations, but also incorporate some traced, in some cases, some traced footprints from Sanborn maps, because for the mill worker homes, it's kind of important to note that all of the homes were basically the same design, just repeated over and over again throughout the neighborhood. So I brought in the Sanborn footprints for those. I didn't do it for all buildings because that would have taken way too much time, but also to just kind of give you this sense of sameness. This is East Durham, you can see there's another mill village there around Franklin Street, Worth Street, Wall Street. A lot of those original homes are still here, and here's where the Durham hosiery mill was. And we have this Bessie Glenn story, which is kind of interesting about taking her work home, which I didn't think about happening in the 1920s. But she was a factory worker and was able to take her work home. And then this is Hayti, which was sort of the historic center for black culture in Durham at the time. And there's this great quote from Reginald Michener about this particular corner in Hayti, which is the one sort of where there's an inset map of there, where you could stand there and see anyone in the city coming by that you knew. So these worked pretty well. But one thing that we really lost was the interactive element, and we lost people standing around the map and having conversations. And I'm sort of, I'll get into that a little bit too, in thinking about the physical space of the exhibit. And one map that did foster conversations really well was this dot map. Everybody seems to love a dot map for some reason these days. And so this is a racial dot map of Durham based on the 2010 census data, and we had a prompt to ask people to see what we're referring to as invisible walls, places, the modalities by which segregation has been maintained over the history of the city. And this map really gets a lot of attention when folks visit the exhibit. So, on our opening night, there were a group of teenagers looking around it and kind of like just saying things like, wow, like there's a lot of red down here. There's a lot of green here. I didn't know that. I can see the walls. So I was pretty happy with how the visual aspect of that drew people in. So in terms of lessons learned, we had an integrated team, meaning that like the cartographer and designer was part of the team from the beginning, and then we also used an iterative process. So we did a lot of designs, and we kept on going back to what's the story? Okay, let's design that. Now what's the story? Let's tweak that. I think that was a really helpful process overall. But it led to some challenges because the rest of the team didn't know much of anything about map or print production or design. And so for one thing, they were always asking to add more text. And for another thing, they were always telling me things like, oh, there's this high-res image of this MLK speech on the web. And for this one in particular, we got there was a week before, and everyone was like, oh yeah, we have the high-res images, And I was like, do you think it's high-res just because it looks clear on your screen? Because we can't print that 30 inches wide at 300 DPI. And I really wish, so just a take-home for folks who are doing this kind of work, I really wish I had taken the time to do like a half-hour presentation on like print production for the rest of the team, because folks were just confused by it. And when I was finally like, this is what DPI means, this is how we calculate scale images, they were like, oh, that makes sense. Now I'm on your side. I don't know why I didn't do that. The corollary to that, it took a heck of a long time to get the archival images scanned for that we wanted to include, and a lot of archives and digital humanities and digitization projects aren't really focused on print production ready digitization. So stuff will be online in a format that's viewable and usable for research, but not usable for producing an exhibit. So we had to go back often and get new scans of most of the materials, and that took a lot of time and money, and there were a number of images we just had to cut because it was impossible to do. We did a lot of tests iterating the design, so we did 2 different pop-up exhibits. The first one we actually gave people post-it notes to comment on, and that worked really well as a feedback mechanism and as an interactivity mechanism, so folks had a lot of engagement. The second one was later on. You're already seeing the design evolve in that second one, and then we did the third actual exhibit. But none of us really thought a lot about the physical space of the exhibit early on. So I mentioned how like that tabletop map had worked really well because people were facing each other. We lost that, and I didn't really consider what we would lose in losing that in the final exhibit. And we also just didn't think about how crammed in people would be in the physical space. So coming from like a computer design or like a digital design background, I just don't think a lot about physical space and things like accessibility, ADA accessibility, how it feels to be reading about some really intense history in a room filled with people, some of whom are like you and some of whom are not like you. We actually got a lot of feedback about like that was pretty uncomfortable to read about in this like crowded room where I didn't know anybody, and I was having to push around people to get to. So thinking about physical space, a thing I'm really grateful we did was doing a color and type design early, and then using Creative Cloud libraries for Adobe to actually sync that across all the folks working on the project. So we were all pulling the same color palette, and it just made map design so easy to be like, oh, okay, I need a blue. Let me use this. Like, we already decided 6 months ago which blue we were going to use. I don't even have to think about it, and that made it possible to design quickly later on. We hired a really good printer who actually fixed a lot of stuff, a lot of little bugs in the files before they went to press. So don't just cost out the cheapest option, and definitely don't print on the web, find somebody local. And then I want to talk about really quickly about new directions with this. So a piece that I really thought we were going to do that we didn't do, and I put it in the talk, was 3D printed map tiles of neighborhoods that don't exist anymore. And so there's actually 2 examples there. I don't know if you can pass those around, Greg, or based on digitizing the historical footprints of buildings and then actually running them through a 3D printer to try to do a model of a part of the city that was destroyed by urban renewal, and then compare it with a part of the city that still exists. So we came up with a workflow with that. It's not perfect, and one thing I'm hoping to do next year is really tweak that. Another thing we did that was really exciting and also didn't see the light of day yet, in part because we haven't gotten formal permission to use the data yet, is working with the full-form census schedules, which are used a lot for genealogical research, but not a lot for statistical research or for sociological research. But they have a wealth of sociological data in here. So I got 2 research assistants to actually digitize the census schedules for 2 enumeration districts in Durham, and you can see on the right the kind of types of detailed sociological statistics we're able to get in comparing these neighborhoods in 1920. So that's neighborhood level data that just doesn't exist anywhere else, and we're actually having to create it anew by looking at the newly released full-form census and doing our own tabulations of it. And really seeing some interesting differences. For example, historians almost never tend to talk about white people living in these majority black neighborhoods, but parts of Hayti, which is the leftmost 2 columns, were up to 30% white. So what was that like? Wanting to use that data then that we're creating new data from Digitizing Census to cross-reference that against the historical data sources that are sort of canonical, like how accurate is this map of race really? We don't know, but maybe by digitizing the city directory it would be possible to do that. And that then leads to some questions about maybe doing spatial analysis. So for example, we know where the factories were, we know where people lived. Could we estimate out pollution impact and then look at, for example, differential life expectancy in Durham and what were the relationships with that? Or how have different neighborhoods seen different impacts from pollution or development over time? So that's that, and then I'll close with another one of these fantastic advertisements for Durham, so y'all should all come. Yeah.